three Ds.
That's it.
We have another seat here. Okay, well, thanks for coming out to our first philosophy event of the semester. We are very pleased to have Professor David Hildebrand be our first speaker. His talk today is on pragmatism and intelligent design. Currently, he is writing a book on John Dewey, and he has published an article in the Southern Journal of Philosophy on the issue of intelligent design. He's also co-authored a paper on education and evolution. So this is right up his alley. So please join me in welcoming Dave Hildebrand.
Thanks a lot. I said a couple things around the room. One is a Doonesbury cartoon, which lucky enough to have Greg Smith send out, and I think this might just sum up the whole talk. So read this, we'll have some cheese, and we'll be done. The other thing is probably a little too detailed of an outline, but this is roughly sort of the more specific map through what I'm going to say. And I wanted to give this out in part because if time runs short, I might not get to everything, and some of you might want to sort of reconstruct the ideal, the map of the promised land in your own time. And some of you might be interested in this issue, so I put a couple footnotes in referring to the sources for some of the claims that I'm just going to repeat as fact here today. So this talk is actually an adaptation of a talk that I gave at the Society for the Advancement of American Philosophy last year, and also in combination with this paper that I wrote in the Southern Journal of Philosophy. And so it's just meant to combine some of the elements from the American philosophy talk that will bring you up to speed a little bit on the conflict between intelligent design or intelligent design creationists and evolutionary biologists. So I'm going to read it, and hopefully we'll leave plenty of time for us to talk about some of the issues. Now, intelligent design is a significant cultural and intellectual issue. It's influenced school policies and the strategies that science teachers use to deal with challenges to evolution. It's raised serious questions in the public's mind over the epistemology of science, getting the public to ask questions like, what is science, what is theory, and what is fact? Some of you might remember the controversy over the Georgia textbooks, required for a while to put a sticker on the textbook saying that evolutionary theory is not fact, that it's just a theory. It's raised questions about whether science has to be certain to be accepted and how science should be taught. My central concern and what I'm interested in this controversy is, at first I got interested in it because of the epistemological issue. Roughly what conception of knowledge is at the heart of this new creationist attack upon science? And how well can contemporary science defend itself? And the more I learned about the epistemological issues, and we'll get into those a little bit as the talk proceeds, the more I got interested in the what's next question, because the epistemological questions didn't seem to be resolving very nicely. And the other reason is because I think that epistemological debates don't really get people out of bed in the morning, let alone run for school board. So resolving the epistemological issues isn't going to resolve the larger cultural conflict, because obviously there are a lot of people who are exercised about this anyway. So what I'd like to assume for the purposes of this talk is that the current cultural frictions aren't going to be assuaged by generally acceptable definitions of knowledge or truth at any time soon. And so the question I'm asking is, what strategies for reconstruction can pragmatism offer to these groups that are at loggerheads? Let me give you a brief recap of the issue. And I have down here on your handout 2 data points on this issue. I think the parallels between our time and Dewey's time are ominous, and they're striking. And they're striking because there seem to be the same large troubles brewing underneath the surface of this controversy. And I'd be curious during the question and answer what you think is underneath this debate, this conflict. In a 1924 piece that Dewey wrote entitled Science, Belief, and the Public, Dewey expressed surprise that a generation which was so accustomed to scientific and technological developments could foment an attack on evolution. I'll go back there. So in his piece, Dewey wrote, and this is a quote on your handout, many of us imagine, and you can imagine saying this yourself today, many of us imagine that a serious attack upon evolutionary views with a revival of pre-Darwinian biology was as improbable as an attack on the astronomy of Galileo or a widespread and influential campaign in behalf of the Ptolemaic system. Right? Nevertheless, Dewey writes, the issue for the public is actual and vital. Today, in spite of the elapse of a generation in which we prided ourselves upon the advance of the scientific spirit and the accommodation of the public to the mind, of the public mind to the conclusions of scientific inquiries. Roughly, who would have thought, right? That a generation so accustomed to science and technology progress could raise such a stink about evolutionary theory. Central to the controversy in Dewey's time was a public that Dewey said had been empowered politically, but was not yet educated in the methods of science. And he goes on, actually this is just a page later, he says, the public has taken an active part, right, in this controversy, but the conditions which have enabled the public actively to intervene have failed in providing an education which would enable the public to discriminate between opinions untouched by scientific method and attitude and the weight of evidence. Now, our own contemporary attitudes about evolution are not much better. And so if you look at the other data point on the handout, the Gallup poll, which was published last year, showed that, and here I'll just tick off a few of their findings. It's actually a rather long survey. More than half of all Americans rejecting evolutionary theory and scientific evidence agree with the statement, God created man exactly how the Bible describes it. More than half. Another 31% says that man did evolve, but God guided it. Only 12% back evolution and say that God had no part. And Gallup summarized the results this way. Surveys repeatedly show that a substantial portion of Americans do not believe that the theory of evolution best explains where life comes from. And this has been their findings year after year after year. Last year was not a fluke. Now, it's been 82 years since Dewey bemoaned the fundamentalist attacks on evolutionary biology, and there have been staggering progress in science and technology. And yet none of these changes have changed very many minds, nor prevented pitched battles over the teaching of evolution in America. Europe, different story. Now, while some of these conflicts, I think, can be explained away as attempts by certain religious groups to assert control over public education, I think we still need to understand the larger cultural conditions which allow these strategies to get so much traction. So I don't think we can really explain away the underlying conditions that make the controversy possible. And that's what I'm trying to look into. So let's look at the contemporary situation in brief. So just to give you a sense of what's going on, let's look at the intelligent design view. And I think I've sketched this a little bit here too, under the contemporary situation. Roughly the problem is this. Evolutionary biologists and teachers of biology are facing what's arguably just the latest varietal of creationism, which most call either intelligent design or intelligent design creationism. I'm going to go with intelligent design, just because it's shorter, but I think they're the same. Now, intelligent design accepts much of evolutionary biology, and this distinguishes it from earlier creationists. However, ID insists that evolutionary biology fails to adequately explain certain biological structures and processes by using impersonal physical causes such as random mutation or the incremental activities of natural selection. In other words, what the ID folks say is that there are certain features, right, certain biological features and processes that they say are irreducibly or specifiedly complex. And they say that these features, right, the presence of such complex features shows by their complexity that they are immune to explanation by the theories of contemporary scientists. Right? Immune to explanation. Not just resistant or difficult to explain, but immune to explanation. Irreducibly complex. That's the important part of that. And the scientists' inability to explain these features proves that an intelligent designer must be posited as the explanation. They also found a watch on the sand on the night. Very complicated one. So that's pretty controversial, right? It's pretty controversial at the very least that people have, rejuvenated a fairly old philosophical argument and dressed it up in some new scientific jargon. But I think it's even more controversial. Right? Take all that controversy, right? Shake your head at it, and then think about the fact that think about the insistence of the intelligent design people that an intelligent designer should be accepted and taught as part of the scientific explanation. They're not saying it should be taught in religion class or in comparative religion class or in a science and religion class. They're saying it belongs in the science curriculum. That's where things get really, really controversial. And that's really where the conflict between intelligent design and science gets going today. And their charge is that scientists have been basically bigots. They have shunned their explanatory route because of their own dogmatic fealty, right? Their loyalty to natural explanations. So their claim is simply that the scientists are, bigoted and prejudiced in their own way. Now, the scientists, for their part, insist that theories be testable. This is going to blow. Go tell your science teachers this. It's going to blow them away. that theories be testable, revisable, and falsifiable. And so in the scientist's view, the ID claims can't be seriously considered because the view that they're positing, the existence of an intelligent designer, cannot be evaluated scientifically. What data would prove the existence of an intelligent designer? How would it be measured or tested? Experimentally. Scientists would ask, well, why couldn't there be a separate intelligent designer for each and every phenomenon that's too complex to explain? Right? Let's have a mini God for every single thing we can't explain. That's irreducibly complex, it's got its own God. I mean, why not that? Okay. It's equally logical, right? It's just as possible logically. So the unwillingness on the scientific community's part to allow the postulation of the intelligent designers has prompted some in the religious and ID groups to tar scientists with the label of materialists. And so giving creationists, any creationist that's listening, can hear that as scientists are godless. We remember that Socrates, too, was part of the charge against Socrates was for studying, things under the earth and the sky. Studying the world under the language or vocabulary of matter. Berkeley, too, stated that one of his chief motivations for creating idealism was to, destroy materialism, because it was godless. So the scientists are fairly well organized. They don't have the kind of money that, say, James Dobson has or other religious organized folks. But they are organized, and so, and they are aware, of course, that there's a lot of hostility towards their position. So Dr. Eugenie Scott, who's the executive director of the National Center for Science Education, has tried to clarify what their position is. And so she's explained that scientists have a commitment to methodological naturalism, right? They have a commitment to explanation by natural causes, matter and energy, which can be observed, measured, tested, and which produces future reliable predictions. Right? Their position does not, she emphasizes this, entail that scientists are also committed to philosophical naturalism. Right? The claim that natural laws are the only thing that exists, that natural objects are the only thing that exists. So she writes, I'm not sure if I put this quote on, it's kind of short. No. She says, look, science in and of itself is neutral to religion because supernatural forces are outside of what it can consider as causation. So I think at the root here of this conflict between scientists and the ID view is a philosophical disagreement. In the creation science conflict of old, the conflict came down to a clash of worldviews, right? Whether it was going to be better for society to choose to describe and explain the universe under the vocabulary of a religious narrative or under the vocabulary of a scientific narrative. Now, this is not the primary disagreement, I don't think, between the ID folks and the scientists. Right? It may be at the root of their conflict under the surface, but I don't think that it's the main thing going on. Primarily, the conflict between intelligent design and science is a philosophical one which is centered on epistemology and the philosophy of science. This is because the ID folks have sought to use the issue of evolution to revise the basic demarcations that circumscribe scientific knowledge and method. That's why it's an issue today. It's not a religious narrative versus a scientific narrative. How should we describe the world? It is, what is science? And can intelligent design import certain kinds of concepts into what is, confidently called the scientific method? So the ID theorist is not simply insisting on another way of telling the human story. Rather, they're breaking with scientific inquiry's guiding principle, which is methodological naturalism. And as another philosopher who writes about this issue and who I've collaborated with, John Capps, the Rochester Institute of Technology, observed about biologists and evolutionary biologists, he says, not only does their methodological naturalism account for the importance of observability and hence empirical testing, it itself is a testable and revisable hypothesis. That's what's so interesting about scientific theory, right? The very method that science uses is itself subject to test and revision. Now, the ID theorist, on the other hand, carries around a belief that can't be called a hypothesis. It can't be tested or revised. In fact, their acceptance of scientific explanation, and they accept a lot of contemporary science, their acceptance of it only extends to those bits and pieces which can support or are irrelevant to a god or a designer's existence. The intelligent designer is a posit, and ultimately it's an item of faith. And because items of faith are by their very nature immune to proof or disproof, we can know about intelligent design as a way of thinking. That if they were to encounter any evidence that implied a cause that was not God, such as randomness or chaos, they would have to reject it out of hand. It's a no-go. So in other words, the ID theorist approach to scientific hypothesis, and this is quoting Capps again, he says, the ID theorist's approach to hypothesis is at the very least unable to make a useful contribution to inquiry. At worst, it's diametrically opposed to scientific inquiry in the first place. Of course, everyone agrees on pretty much of all these groups, everyone agrees on what's necessary to religion. Everyone agrees that in this controversy, that supernatural entities are very important elements of religion, and no one is proposing that what we call religion can go without a god or gods. And so just to hammer the point home, the bone of contention here is whether or not science can incorporate God, or an intelligent designer, or whatever you'd like to call it, as an explanatory cause and still be science. And it makes very little difference whether ID theorists accept most of evolutionary biology's conclusions or not, as long as they insist that scientific theory accept any supernatural causes or claims to that effect. They violate science's deepest methodological commitments. And so it's for this reason right? Much more plausibly, I think, than the idea that scientists are secular bigots, right, or atheists, which is also a claim that's thrown at them. It's for this reason, right, that scientists are compelled by the dictates of what they do, science, to exclude ID proponents from serious dialogue, and more important, from science education. I'm not sure how serious the dialogue can get. They can try it. But from science education, that's a deal breaker, as they say, the real deal. Now, I want to say a couple words about one helpful aspect of Dewey's pragmatism regarding the epistemological issue, and that is the nature of warranted assertability and inquiry. And that's on the handout. First, let's take stock of where we are. First, there's a conflict. There are a couple things going on in this cultural situation. First, there's a conflict at the social and the political level between those who would teach Darwinian-based evolutionary theory in schools without also entertaining other approaches, not least because those approaches have not survived the scrutiny of the community of scientists. That's one aspect. Second, there's the conflict that I just described at the epistemological level between the ID proponents and the scientists over what counts as an admissible scientific theory or explanation. And so, as I said before at the beginning of the talk, I don't believe that an extended debate with ID proponents over this latter issue, the epistemological issue, is really necessary. I think science is pretty well defined and its methods ratified by constant testing and revision. To make this kind of a debate necessary. But if some of you want to object, I'd stipulate that it's necessary, but I still want to set it aside for this paper. What I want to do next is first I want to describe a warning that Dewey made to scientists. And this will help dispel the notion that a lot of people have about John Dewey, if they remember who he was or know that he wasn't the inventor of the Dewey Decimal System. I want to get that out there to the public. Right? Go spread the word. That was Noble Dewey. Dewey warned scientists about believing too much in their own scientific concepts. A lot of people think that Dewey was so pro-science he was, scientistic, right? Sort of unreflectively pro-science, but he wasn't. And he warned scientists about their own practices. So I want to mention that briefly, his warning to scientists, and then I want to go on and describe some ways that we can maybe diffuse the conflict between religion and science, between intelligent design and science in the culture. Now, Dewey, one thing to note is that for Dewey, his epistemological approach, for those of you who haven't heard of this before, called pragmatism. Sometimes it's better instrumentals. And Dewey said, look, when we search for knowledge, right, when we engage in what's called inquiry, and the goal of inquiry is not truth. We want to arrive at propositions that are stable, which stand the test of experiment and time, but rather than call this truth, right, some timeless property, Dewey said, let's just call it warranted assertability, or just warrant. Why do we try to get knowledge in the first place? Back up, think about what we're doing. We inquire because we're trying to move forward. And to move forward, we need some kind of a solution that satisfies certain desires and criteria. We need warrant for our propositions so we can act. Because the test of a proposition is eventually an action that we'll take in the world with real consequences. Dewey's notion of warrant already builds in and implies the presence of a normative dimension. A lot of concern is about whether or not science is divorced from the world of morals. Right? Are facts and values categorically separated? That in part is, I don't want to go into this at length now, but that is in part the result of thinking of knowledge as a quest for truth rather than as a struggle to attain enough confidence in what the solution you're trying to apply that you can act on. So let me give you a couple examples using warrant. Right? if I say, for example, that I'm warranted in pulling the plug on a sparking toaster, we're not just referring to some truth property, which is assuring us that this action will keep our toast unburnt. Actually, the word warrant here is referring to a whole complex situation full of factual details and certain values and norms that are at stake. Those norms and values are already embedded, and so the warrant of the proposition behind the action to unplug a toaster, right, in this case, is indexed to the whole situation. So warrant is indexed to situation. On the other hand, if I say, if we talk about pulling the plug on a life support machine, we understand automatically, or almost automatically, that this is a radically different situation. And the degree of warrant needs to be much more stringent and commensurate with the facts and values involved. In both cases, there are facts and values involved. Whether we're warranted in asserting one proposition in one case is indexed to all of the facts and values involved in that case, and the same thing with a more serious case. So warrant is contextual, situational, and normative. So in Dewey's version of epistemology, knowledge does not aim at truth. In fact, you could say that knowledge doesn't even aim at warrant. What we would rather say is that inquiries which utilize conceptual propositions seek warrant because they want to resolve the problematic situation that led to the inquiry in the first place. Some cases of warrant may seem completely theoretical. If you think about scientists warranting certain theoretical claims about other theoretical claims, that may seem, well, where does the rubber meet the road there? But for Dewey, the ultimate validation of a claim or a proposition's warrant is eventually the actions and operations that are relevant to the problematic situation at hand. No problem is ever purely epistemic. We reason and we act in the world of values. And anyone who's been following some of the recent flurry of activity about string theory will remember that string theory is now hitting some rocky shoals because it has been 30 years and a couple generations of grad students and tenured professors, and it hasn't produced any experimental results or any predictions. So it is hitting hard times, even though it's among the most theoretical of all the scientific enterprises in physics, maybe even in general, because it's not producing any experimental testing, it's not producing any predictions, there's no road, right? It's just spinning frictionlessly in the void. I invented that phrase, right? How does this relate to Dewey's view of the scientist? Well, how does all this background on scientific warrant amount to the warning that I promised you a couple of moments ago? I sort of digressed into a little mini lecture on pragmatism epistemology. Consider this. If it's true, right, if it's true that our inquiries derive from and influence a world of facts and values, then all problematic situations, including those we call scientific ones, call out for judgments of practice and not just judgments of truth. And it's also the case that we are obliged to conform our practices to the fullest possible range of our values. So to the scientist, Dewey says this: scientific inquiry, like all inquiry, is an organic process. It grows from and it returns to living problems. Scientists must be more than just sensitive and tolerant to those around them. They must ensure that the very methods of science do not result in methods which are become frozen or hypostasized, as he would say, treated like an algorithm or some kind of a fixed formula. Scientific inquiries are dynamic interactions with a changing and evaluational world. It's one kind of interaction with the world among many. And and we forget this because the power of science to predict and control create a widespread amnesia among us that science is not somehow ultimate and magisterial and final. Scientists, Dewey was warning them, have to vigilantly remind themselves that the things or events that science investigates do not constitute final natural kinds or reveal essential traits. Science can't change its mind whenever it wants, of course. inquiry that's going to be of lasting use and value is going to go nowhere without consistent resources that are both physical and conceptual. So the resources that do an enormous amount of work for science, Dewey says, let's call those directing conceptions. I have a quote about that. Yeah, there's a quote on the handout about this, right? Science have to avoid taking their directing conceptions too dogmatically. And one of the reasons is that dogmatism about your directing ideas or your directing conceptions is that it renders these conceptions inert just when they're most needed to be revisable and functionally available for new inquiries. Right? Just to put it in plain language, race, in our culture, race is an important and useful theoretical word. The more we rigidify and think of race as being a single thing and meaning something absolutely perfectly defined, the more useless it becomes for mitigating new circumstances that come down the pike. It has to be stable. It has to mean something that we can all relatively agree on. But the more ossified and rigid it gets, the less useful it becomes. So Dewey writes about directing conceptions. That directing conceptions tend to be taken for granted after they've once come into general currency. In consequence, they either remain implicit or unstated, or else are propositionally formulated in a way which is static instead of functional. Failure to examine the conceptual structures and frames of reference which are unconsciously implicated in even the seemingly most innocent factual inquiries is the greatest single defect that can be found in any field of inquiry. Even in physical matters, after a certain conceptual frame of reference has once become habitual, it tends to finally become obstructive with reference to new lines of investigation. You can tell that there's a certain kind of narcosis that comes from reading a long Dewey quote. Sort of, it all sounds right, but I just can't pay attention. That's how it feels for me, at least. This is one of my favorite guys. In our world, most people know, I'll give you a couple examples, and we'll move past this idea onto solutions. I know you want to get out there and go talk to some folks after this talk. Most people know that medical inquiries over even just the last half century, transformed the directing conceptions of disease and death. The meaning of those terms have changed both for scientists and for laypersons. What's less reflexively understood, I think, is that these redefinitions of these terms came about because of real transactions with people who demanded solutions to living problems, such as the need to transplant organs in a timely and effective fashion. That was a primary motivator for the redefinition of death. Those transactions forced people to take narrow scientific inquiries, like about disease, and force those concepts into conceptual discussion with more communal concepts, with things like quality of life and safety. And the result was a more meaningful resolution to the inquiries in which, to take death for an example, death was a primary part. So to sum up again, when dealing with a conflict between science and intelligent design folks need to be reminded that epistemologically, they're trying to change deeply held epistemic values of scientists. Scientists need to be reminded and need to remember that they too can become religious about their own concepts, particularly when they forget that deeply corroborated and experimentally verified scientific truths are really just warranted, and someday may be revised or overturned entirely. So scientists need to be reminded that they too traffic in the contextual and the provisional, not in the ultimate and the certain. So are we done? No, not by a long shot. Although the clock keeps ticking. So I think initially I wanted to explain how an account of inquiry like Dewey's, and this was my hope rather. I had hoped that an explanation of how inquiry works, what warrant is, and all this stuff could help smooth out the central friction of the idea evolution debate. After all, I thought, pragmatism grew up in a philosophical world that was sort of riven by absolutisms. and about divisions between philosophical camps and between mind and body and experience and nature and all the rest. Pragmatism grew out of the need to perspectivize knowledge and reality and address disputes. And James's little book Pragmatism is about trying to help people get along better in the world. Ultimately, it's a way of trying to foment peace and cooperation. I mean, I thought, look, if James, this was my, I knew, I found out I was wrong about this, but you know, as a philosopher, I'm always walking around with a certain amount of sort of recurrent hubris. And I thought, look, if James could use pragmatism to address the problem of free will and determinism, surely those same tools could be used to, you know, adjudicate this little dispute between some science educators, some religious people. Come on, if it could pound that nail, it could pound that nail. Wrong. Wrong. No. I found out that it's one thing to try to harmonize very different perspectives at the level of philosophical theory, and it's another thing to try to harmonize perspectives at the level of practical conflict. When we're sorting out complex socio-political differences over, for example, what sound science is, it's a Bush administration phrase, sound science, it's tremendously difficult to know just how much diversity we can embrace before the canons of logic, right, which are indispensable to our practice, begin to be undermined. Surely any pragmatist who thinks that she can embrace as much diversity as possible must also have to show how a pragmatic approach to diversity can embrace differences while at least retaining some norms of sound judgment. You want to throw out the bathwater, right? Keep the baby. But you have to throw out some bathwater. You can't just keep up. That's not a tenable situation either. So, pragmatism's method sometimes has been called pluralism, and where pluralism means an approach to problems that strives to include as diverse a range of goals and methods and practices as possible. But this is a case, I found out, that is really immune to pragmatist lectures about pluralism. Right? Because here, the antagonists clearly and explicitly and consciously have goals and viewpoints that are only achievable given the exclusion of the other goals and viewpoints. They're really at loggerheads. That's why an epistemological solution cannot help. Their goals and their views are consciously held and they're at loggerheads. So what else can we do? So now I'm going to sort of move to the latter part of this, what's on the handout, which is strategies for a resolution, 4 steps towards creating a total attitude. First thing that has to be realized, Dewey says, is that all inquiry, regardless of what kind, proceeds within a cultural matrix, which is ultimately determined by the nature of social relations. The subject matter of physical inquiry at any time falls within a larger social field. Scientific realists will be accept this. Dewey thought it was absolutely crucial. The subject matter of physical inquiry at any time falls within a larger social field. The techniques available at a given time depend upon the state of material and intellectual culture. So in this case, because inquiry is hopelessly blocked at the epistemic level, we have to address elements of the problem that are more than epistemic, or if you prefer, less than epistemic, where you fall on that question. We have to seek larger common ground. And the common ground, that the label that I'm giving it to is a phrase from Dewey. It's called a total attitude. And Dewey thought the way we get out of these kinds of intractable conflicts is by trying to develop a total attitude. A total attitude is a response that does more than just reiterate accounts of knowledge or truth or scientific method. He says, it's another slightly long quote, he says, the demand for a total attitude arises because there is a need of integration in action of the conflicting various interests in life. When the scientific interest conflicts with, say, the religious, or the economic with the scientific or aesthetic, or when conservative concern for order is at odds with progressive interest in freedom, or when institutionalism clashes with individuality, there is a stimulus to discover some more comprehensive point of view from which the divergencies may be brought together and consistency or continuity of experience recovered. So it's not just science religion, it's also the conflict between people who would like beautiful highways and people who want to put billboards up on highways because they want the revenue, right? It's between the economic and the aesthetic. It's between the religious and the economic. It's all of those clashes require that the people who are engaged in them find a way of backing off and construct something more comprehensive, right? Something like community. So when we think about creation scientists, creationists or intelligent designers and contemporary scientists, it immediately strikes us, I think, right off the bat, how different these groups of people are. Their conflict seems so deeply rooted in how dissociated the groups are. And you might think that these groups are so, and someone like Rawls, who says, look, in a society, there's always going to be radical differences between groups of folks. And so the best you can really hope for is some kind of procedural middle ground where people say, we're going to vote on Tuesday, we're going to vote on Tuesday. We're going to have, those sorts of procedural agreements are all Rawls thought we could really strive for. I think Dewey would say that that's just not enough. We have to be able to develop a comprehensive attitude that's more than just about the procedures, because those procedures rest on values and facts too, and so are liable to some of the same disjunctions. So he said, think about the most disparate groups you can. Even they, in certain fundamental respects, for them in the same fundamental respects, the same predicaments of life recur. And this provides for Dewey a touchstone for the hope that challenges can be met from the perspective of a single community, despite our many other differences. So our progress towards the ideal of a total attitude, he argues, is more than just strategic politics. It demands that philosophy be done from a practical and educational or educative perspective. We have to build community to get over this conflict. So now I'm gonna sort of wind up this talk by describe the total attitude as being some kind of a solution, or at least a path to a solution in the intractable conflict between scientists and intelligent designers. Okay? Now I want to talk quickly about 4 possible steps, and there might be more and there might be less, probably many more. 4 steps towards creating that perspective. One step towards creating a total attitude is striving toward attaining an educational perspective, one that attends to the particular context in which problems emerge. So for example, we might want to avoid too rashly judging the idea that every intelligent design evolutionary biology conflict is the same. We can take a more educated perspective on that conflict by saying, well, let's see, one of them happened in Ohio. How is science taught in Ohio? What religions are dominant there? What about Pennsylvania? What about Texas? What are the specific ingredients in play in all those things? I think we're very quick to say, well, there's this debate between intelligent design and creationism, when in fact it may be extremely important differentiations based on what happens in Pennsylvania and what has happened, or what happens in Texas. Texas is a whole nother planet, for those of you who've never been there. It's a whole different environment. So we don't want to too quickly glom this debate into one category. And that helps to create a more total attitude. A second step towards creating a more total attitude would be trying to overcome factionalization and parochialism by building community, or at least communal perspectives, which transcend these periodic conflicts. The way you transcend these conflicts is they're forged in conjoined activities that are consciously shared and communicated. So the idea here is that groups need to find ways to work together on common problems that are outside of the problems that they're currently at loggerheads about. And I have, there's an example, I'm not sure I put it on here. Yeah, there's an example of how pro-life and pro-choice antagonists could, and they actually have gotten together to talk about how to reduce teen pregnancy. So you can actually step out of the thing that is currently creating the conflict with conjoined, consciously shared activities to solve a problem that where there is no argument or a heat. And so this is a way of thinking about cooperation between disparate groups in society that is not just toleration. That word implies that, well, if I tolerate you, it means that I don't really like you, I don't share your values, I don't ever want to work on anything with you, but I'm not going to try to kill you. Right? I'm not going to try to sort of oust you from political power or what have you. So this is more than just toleration, or it's more than just inclusion. This is a way of trying to create a group that is forged around an activity and around common values. There are always common values. Everyone wants to breathe. So that's the second step. Okay? The third step towards a total or more comprehensive attitude can come out of developing criteria for criticizing groups that would opt out of social norms. It's a little. This is the bathwater. This is getting rid of the bathwater. In other words, it might seem paradoxical, but it's only through our willingness to develop criteria which would exclude certain groups from participation in society or dialogue that we can actually forge a more comprehensive attitude. Right? And I'll give you Dewey's criteria for how you know a group should be excluded or not in just a second. But if you think about the sorts of groups that we do exclude or we would like to exclude, think about the mafia or separatists or racists. And what Dewey pointed out is that there are many groups that form their identity and grow it by appealing to an insularity that's not healthy. And so the result is societal factionalization, which increasingly fractures those forms of community which are necessary to create a total attitude. And I'm going to skip a little bit here, but I wanted to just point out on the handout that there are a lot of forces in society that factionalize us that are not as dramatic as the mafia or as racists or neo-Nazis or skinheads or anything like that. There are forces like retirement communities, gated communities, shopping clubs, charter schools, focus groups, niche marketing, target demographics, and micro-demographics. Okay? Brand loyalty. There are a whole bunch of different forces that are employed by everyday common citizens, by the media, by marketers and advertisers, by politicians, to factionalize us along many different lines. And I think we shy away from criticizing these groups because Americans have a penchant for both association and for privacy. And so it often seems impossible to find grounds on which we could criticize a group. But Dewey gives us criteria. In Democracy and Education, he said, if you think about a gang or a clique and you want to know why can we exclude them, or why can we basically criticize them for their behavior? He says, all groups, it's typical of even the most isolated groups, that they hold some interests in common among themselves, and they have some interaction and cooperation with other groups. That's true of all groups. So if you think about that fact, the generic trait of human society, you can go on and ask about the groups. And I think I put these criteria on here. A, how numerous and varied are the interests which are consciously shared? And B, how full and free is the interplay with other forms of association? And so if you measure a group against these criteria, it doesn't have to be criminal in order to possess traits that, while they may not be inherently immoral, they engender, lead to, create conflicts and internecine strife. And I'm going to skip this next long quote of groups. But the point is just that there are a lot of ways that we remain parochialized and factionalized in our society. And this parochialization and factionalization has to be recognized and overcome to create something like a more comprehensive sense of community. The fourth and last step that I want to mention, and then I will be done, is the formation of democratic ideals through education and communication. Now this is an extremely big topic, and I just want to mention that forming democratic ideals rests upon habits of communication which are trained to be self-consciously imaginative and hypothetical. when education is made up of pedagogies which place a premium upon memorization and authority, or on outcomes, on accountability, or upon these, this is the emphasis is being placed on rhetorics of isolation and exclusivity, and this can be our main source of factionalization, the roots of our anti-scientific attitude, maybe at present. And Dewey didn't think that the public's failure to think scientifically could simply be laid at the feet of religious educators. And remember, he's spreading the blame around a little bit, and then I think is one important thing I want you to take away, that in this conflict, there is a lot of blame to be spread around. Some of it belongs with the intelligent design folks who would insist on violating the most deeply held methodological beliefs of scientists. Another blame can be placed on scientists who come to think of themselves as so certain and ultimate in their own categorizations that they forget that there are lots of other ways of defining and interpreting and interacting with the world. But it's also it's also the fault of a lot of us who basically don't combat some of these bad habits of thinking in our own lives. He says, there's a considerable class of influential persons, enlightened and liberal in technical, scientific, and religious matters, who are only too ready to make use of appeal to authority, prejudice, emotion, and ignorance to serve their purposes in political and economic affairs. Then they sit back in amazed sorrow when this same habit of mind displays itself violently with regard to, say, the animal origin of man. So a lot of us are out there using bad arguments and appealing to authority when it suits us, and then we're amazed to see that, oh my gosh, there are people who don't accept evolution. So Dewey was insisting that, this habit of inquiry in a sort of provisional and hypothetical way has to infect the way we look at all of the different situations in our lives, not just our pet peeves like evolution. Modeling responsible inquiry begins with learning how to communicate properly. That is, in a way that allows us to examine things for their significance and devise strategies for coping with problems. The more impoverished our means of communication, the less able we are to navigate around incongruent principles and towards common ground and acts of cooperation. All right, conclusion, and then we can talk. I've tried to show here today that there are at least two different levels of conflict going on between intelligent design and evolutionists. At one level, the conflict is philosophical, and it centers around what scientific explanation is or should be. At another level, the conflict is political, and it centers around which values should dominate science education. In response to the first conflict, I've argued that pragmatism has an epistemological position that's less susceptible to attacks of intelligent design, because it would explain scientific success by reference to its warranted assertability of its directing conceptions rather than their truth. In response to the second conflict, I've argued that epistemological arguments, such as the one about warrant, are insufficient. And here I'm suggesting that pragmatism can help provide methods that will diffuse and even dissolve the ID-science conflict through the creation of a total attitude, an attitude which would represent what is healthiest and most productive about human community. This paper then sketched four methods with which we could try to create the total attitude. All those methods were grounded in Dewey's philosophy. None of the methods are sure to succeed, and any success is always contingent upon continued vigilance. Ultimately, the creation of democracy or peace rests upon the ability of each generation to successfully reenact and innovate the habits which make eternal vigilance more than a pipe
dream. We have time for questions and discussion.
My daughter teaches behavioral science, and she attempts to communicate with her students and to anyone who will listen to her because she's passionate about this. The meaning of the word theory, when we're talking about word in its common usage sort of implies something I think might be so, maybe, which is really how scientists use the word hypothesis. A scientific theory, from her perspective as a science teacher, is that currently acceptable set of ideas that virtually all scientists accept as the current set of information that's operating about a given thing, such as the theory of evolution. So she's trying to wean people away from using theory, mistakenly meaning hypothesis. You get it to, that is what we currently think, if we're thinking clearly the way scientists do. However, it occurs to me that it still has that common meaning, that it can't divorce itself utterly from the possible, the open-endedness that the word theory has. So what you're saying is, yeah, scientific theory, even as grounded as it is in what all the very best currently accepted information, is still open to further revision, further thinking.
You want to answer that? Yeah.
Just a thing to add to this. I see it so many times in students' faces, as soon as they say, you know, but that's just a theory. In their minds, it means, that's not true. We don't have to accept that. It's just a theory. It's just a thought that someone entertains. But the Bible is true. This is a theory. It's dismissible in their minds because it's a theory.
Right.
And
That's
she's trying to get at.
right. That's the problem. And that is, and that the first quote I read from Dewey was just sort of the sense of amazement that after all these years of people getting used to science and technology, that they still hadn't been able, they hadn't been educated in a way that made them comfortable with the tentative nature of science's conclusions. I think my understanding is that hypothesis is it's a working guess, right? It's a working estimate of a particular scientific problem, and a theory is sort of a whole network of the best warranted hypotheses. So I see theory and hypothesis.
That tested out true over and over and over and over.
Well, I see theory as sort of an umbrella over a lot of hypotheses, which are as warranted as possible. But the important thing that you're noting is that they're both tentative, right? They're both provisional and capable of revision. Yeah. So they're actually, it's Louis Menand. Pragmatism was dominant in American philosophy departments in the first half of the 20th century, and a lot of people have wondered. Well, I mean, there were almost every department chair of every powerful philosophy department, right? Columbia, Rutgers, and you name it, had a pragmatist at the helm, and pragmatism went out of vogue during the Cold War, and there are various theories as to why this happened, but I sort of like the theory Louis Menand advanced, which is that the Cold War brought such a desire and a longing for certainty, such a longing for security. Dewey says, we start out as human animals wanting security, and we wind up making epistemological security, and we convert it into certainty. That's why his book is called one of his books is called The Quest for Certainty. So the question, and that's why I think epistemological solutions aren't enough. We have to say, what makes people insecure, and how can they be made to understand that science is the tentative nature of science's conclusion doesn't make them less secure, it actually makes them more secure, because it means that, you can revise your hypotheses. I don't know if anyone saw the New Yorker cartoon or the Dewsbury cartoon. The guy who goes to the doctor, and the doctor says, I'm a creationist, I'm an intelligent designer, and the doctor says, well, would you like the latest development of the drug, or would you like the one of the earliest version of the germ, right? Which antidote would you like? The one for the evolved version of the germ? I didn't know that joke very well. But, everyone chooses, he says, give me the one that has the best chance of working. So, when their life is on the line, everyone becomes a pragmatist.
Well, kind of going back to the no pluralism economies to get rid of pragmatism, one of the things that I'm kind of on the second step, trying to get projects together so that these two groups can work with one another, that kind of seems to be the problem. I mean, fundamentally is that even when they start working on this project together to get kids to learn science better, that's where this happens. It's on the school boards. It's when they're constructing books for classes, and I'm just trying to.
Well, you don't want to.
Figure out
You don't want
what
to try to.
projects it would
You don't
be.
want to try to get people to work together on the thing that they're having an argument about. So you don't want to get pro-life folks and pro-choice folks to get together to talk about the problem of what to do with a pregnancy. You want to get them together to talk about the problem of how to reduce the amount of number of teen pregnancies
all I'm
to
trying to say
begin with.
is it's hard for me to figure out what
What would
I
they?
to find an example of where it would be that they could get together with the evolution problem, but not really be, I don't know, talking about it per se. Not.
I'm open to answers.
To kind of add on to that, it seems to me like the idea of creating a sort of total attitude where those kind of dialogical, I don't want to say debates, because you don't want debates, but conversations where those kind of things could happen. It seems like you kind of talk about those in terms of groups getting together, but the problem to me seems to be with the values. And values kind of transcend groups, whereas you'll have groups who are opposed factionally, they may share common values, and people within the same group may have conflicting values.
Yeah.
The idea of getting groups together, it seems that the problem is more deeply entrenched than that.
Well, the point of this this second step is that we all have many values, and what we need to do is we need to work together on those values that we have in common, and put aside the values that we're a loggerhead about. In other words, we have this desire to always go at a problem by going right at the bullseye every time. And the point is, like, I mean, you might love Derrida and think he's the greatest thing since, right, sliced bread. And I might think, what? Okay. I mean, if you know. And I might think that Derrida, was, the worst thing since Stalin. Now, we're not going to work on that problem together, but we might work on things about, well, how can we get high schools to teach philosophy, because we both respect it. And that process, it's that process that tends to sort of soften, we're trying to soften up the nugget of disagreement, and I think it's working. Some people, you can't talk to people when they're at their angriest, though. That's another.
Well, in line with what has been said, and I think what you're driving at here, can you go back, and I don't know if I'm doing an abuse of Dewey's terminology here, but to the definition of the total attitude here, or not the definition of it, but what demands it. The demand for a total attitude arises because there's a need for integration and action in the conflicting various interests in life. Would it be an abuse of language to go back and say the demand for a total attitude arises or is warranted because there is a need for integration and action in conflicting various interests in life? In other words, is it possible then that maybe some total attitudes are warranted and some total attitudes are not warranted? And that maybe the conflict between intelligent design and evolution cannot have a total attitude because in some sense it's really not warranted yet. But you could perhaps raise a question about what is the purpose of education? What is the effect of education? And those sorts of questions where a total attitude might be warranted between the conflicting viewpoints. But I'm wondering if that might be an abuse of the notion of warranted to say that a total attitude, I mean, maybe we have a false loggerhead here. The loggerhead is about education and not about intelligent design and evolution.
Yeah.
We'll never get those two together because it's not warranted.
You're over-philosophizing that sentence. Okay? What it says is the demand for a total attitude arises because there is a need, think a biological need or an organism need, of integration and action of the conflicting various interests in life. We got a flood, we got a canoe, we got two paddles, we got me and you. I want to be in the front, I want to be in the front, I want to be in the front, I want to be in the front.
Sit back to back. You're both
There is a need. Right, this is,
There you go.
there is, in other words, the point I'm making is that the demand for total attitude comes about because there's a need for integration and action. There's a need to get along
Right.
and cooperate.
And I'm actually wondering if there is a need for